Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Courtney Stone, and I'm the Animal Care Manager at Wallace Annenberg PetSpace. We're excited to welcome you to a very special Animal Matters session. Today, we welcome a team of experts from the Los Angeles Zoo who will be sharing a special look at their California Condor Recovery Program and the species-saving work that they do with these incredible animals. At Annenberg PetSpace, while we may focus on dogs, cats, and small critters for adoption, Wallace Annenberg herself is an avid lover of all animals. Along with the Annenberg Foundation, she recently provided a conservation challenge grant to help create a wildlife crossing at Liberty Canyon over the 101 freeway, which will be the largest wildlife crossing in the world. It will reconnect a long fragmented ecosystem, a biodiversity hotspot, and help protect the endangered mountain lion population and other wildlife that make their homes in the Santa Monica Mountains. These conservation efforts are crucial to our local ecosystem, and the LA Zoo's work with the California Condors embodies these efforts on the iconic level, recognized by so many who visit their world-class zoo every year. We will begin with their presentation and we'll have time for a Q&A session afterwards. Please hold your questions until then. Now, we are pleased to welcome Chandra David, Dr. Dominique Keller, and Beth Shafer of the Los Angeles Zoo. Chandra David is an animal keeper at the zoo. She received her degree in anthropology, hoping to fulfill her desire to work with and study primates. But 25 years ago, the Los Angeles Zoo provided her with the opportunity to work with one of the most endangered species in the world. And from then on out, she was hooked on working with California condors. Her affinity for California condors has opened her heart to all species of vultures, and she finds that she now has an insatiable passion for all of these magnificent birds. Dr. Dominique Keller is the Chief Veterinarian and Director of Animal Health and Wellness at the LA Zoo, as well as the two-toed sloth Species Survival Plan Vet Advisor. She received her undergraduate degree in biology from the New College of USF in Sarasota, Florida, a PhD in reproductive biology or physiology, and her DVM degree at Texas A&M University. Dr. Keller spent over 6 years as a senior veterinarian at Busch Gardens, Tampa Bay, before more recently moving to Los Angeles for her current position with the LA Zoo. Beth Shafer joined the LA Zoo as the Director of Animal Program in December of 2014. Her background includes primates, marine mammals, birds, and ambassador animals. In her role, she oversees all aspects of the zoo and the animal care division at the zoo, and is deeply committed to saving animals in the wild. Her conservation focus is currently Growers gorillas in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where she lends her husbandry expertise to help rehabilitate gorillas orphaned by poaching, and the conservation of pronghorn on the Baja Peninsula, where the Los Angeles Zoo is helping to repopulate these unique animals and bring awareness to these often overlooked species. Please join me in welcoming Chandra, Dr. Keller, and Beth. And I will go ahead and hand it off to, I believe Beth is going to be the first one speaking tonight.
I am. Thank you so much, Courtney. We are really happy to be here. So welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. I will start with an overview of our program here at the zoo. So let me get my PowerPoint up here, hopefully. Okay. So as I said, this will be a little history of what we have done here at the zoo. And our journey with condors actually started, long before the Condor program, the recovery program actually started. And the very first condor that was brought here to the Los Angeles Zoo was Topa Topa, and that was way back in 1967. Basically the beginning of the zoo, and Topa Topa is still here with us today. He has fathered chicks and he is a big important part of the program. And one of the really cool things about Topa is that he wasn't thriving in the wild, which as a chick, which is why he was brought here. And so he is one of the only, or the only wild born, wild hatched bird that we actually know their age. And people often ask how long condors live, and the truth is that we really don't know yet. And TOPA is helping us to answer that question. So fast forward 20 years to 1987, and the last of the wild condors, there's only 27 birds left in the wild or on the planet. And so the decision was made to bring them all into zoos. They came to the Los Angeles Zoo, of course, and also to the San Diego Wild Animal Park. This was really amidst a lot of controversy. There was a lot of people that really thought that this was not a good move and those birds should stay in the wild for some good reasons and some not so good reasons. Some people thought that if the birds weren't out in the wild, their habitat would not be protected. And some people just thought that they should never be under human care. Fortunately, it was the right decision, as we have basically proven. So it was only 2 years after those birds came in 1987 that the first condor was hatched here at the LA Zoo. And then a few years later, that 2 birds were released back into the wild. And then things progressed. By 95, there were 13 condors in the wild and 90 condors in zoos. So this was obviously a successful program, and things were going really well. You know, now as of 2020, there were over 500 California condors existing on the planet from those original 27 birds. There's over 300 that are free flying, and they're reproducing in the wild now and doing well. One of their biggest threats, though, is lead bullets. And I know that Dr. Keller will talk a lot about how we have to deal with that. But condors are vultures. They do eat carrion. And so when hunters shoot animals, they'll leave the gut pile or the carcass, depending on what they're shooting, and the lead is in those animals, and the condors come in and eat them and are poisoned by that lead. So it's really still a very big problem. Fortunately, lead bullets are now basically illegal in California. It's been a phase-in where they eliminated the use of lead bullets, or they were banned the use of lead bullets in the California Condors range. And then it progressed to basically all of California. Unfortunately, it's not easy to enforce that law, and there still is lead out there. So the LA Zoo has some specific contributions to the condor recovery. We've done several different things. One of our biggest things, I know Chandra will talk more about this also, is that we make eggs, right? So we have our birds paired up. The eggs are incubated and the chicks are reared here at the LA Zoo. And that has been a process of trial and error and learning. You may have heard of the program where we used to raise the chicks with puppets. Here is a picture of the hand puppets, so that the birds would imprint on that and not imprint on humans. And then, you know, they started realizing that parent reared chicks, any animal really, if they're raised by their parents, does better than human reared animals. So they pioneered double clutching, which is where an egg would be removed from the parents after they laid it and put in an incubator. This would induce the parents to lay another egg. Sometimes you can even do this 3 times. So you were upping the number of birds that you could produce in a single year. And then just a few years ago, in 2017, I believe, our staff here decided that they had this idea to try double brooding. So usually condors in the wild will lay 1 egg, and both parents take care of 1 egg, and they only have 1 chick to worry about. But because here at the zoo, we can provide all the food they need, they're obviously safe here, there's not the stressors of living in the wild, they decided to try giving 1 pair of birds 2 chicks to rear. And I have a little video here of 1 parent bird with 2 chicks, and this is in one of the nest boxes here at the LA Zoo. You can see 2 little heads here and 1 very protective parent taking care of it. And that has been a big success. So it's been a great thing for the condor population to be able to let one pair of condors raise 2 chicks instead of 1 every year. So another thing that our staff does that they have great expertise in is help with nest entries. So because we have these animals here at the zoo, our staff is very well versed and they are experts in how to handle chicks without hurting them and without stressing out the parents. So they have all learned to rappel, and they rappel into condor nests they nest on cliff ledges. It's really an amazing thing. And they'll go in and they can check eggs for viability, and they will check the chicks for health checks. And they will do things like check for microtrash, which is little pieces of plastic that the parents sometimes will mistakenly feed the chicks to see if there's any microtrash in the nest. And one of the biggest things that we have been able to do is to train the wildlife biologists in handling the chicks and handling eggs and checking the nests, because we have all this hands-on experience, and wildlife biologists were used to being very hands-off. So that has been one of the biggest contributions that our staff here at the LA Zoo has been able to make. And I think Chandra might talk a little bit more. She has some very daring nest entries that she has done. This picture on the right was me. This year I got to go on a nest entry with Mike Clark, who's the one on the left. This was a little bit easier of an entry, although it was still like a mile straight down the cliffside and a mile straight back out, and then a scramble down to the actual nest ledge. And Mike has so much expertise. He went down, he encouraged the parents to come out of their nest, which is basically just an overhang of a cliff, so that he could check the egg for viability. He taught 2 other wildlife biologists how to do that, and they also installed the camera in that nest. And you can see the parents sitting here, not far at all from us, very relaxed. And one of the really cool things about checking on this nest is that the male, number 26 over here that you can see, is a bird that had been injured in the wild, and he came here to the LA Zoo for medical attention. I believe it was a wing injury, and they repaired that and helped him heal, and now he's back out in the wild making babies. So honestly, this was one of the most amazing experiences of my entire career. I couldn't believe I was sitting there with these condors just letting us do what we needed to do. It was really an incredible, incredible day. And then one of the other feathers in our cap, I should say, pun intended, that we have here at the zoo are ambassador condors. So we are the only zoo anywhere in the world that has ambassador condors. We have 2 now, which is really exciting. Dolly here on the left was our first ambassador condor. She came here with a wing injury. She was wild hatched, and they tried to repair it, but it couldn't be repaired to the point where she could survive in the wild. She also, apologies Dolly, but she doesn't have great genetics, so she was not a candidate for the breeding program. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife gave us permission to have her as an ambassador condor, and so she now helps us teach people about the Condor program. And then more recently, Hope is another California Condor that had a wing injury. She came in. It was partially repairable. So but not enough for her to survive in the wild. So she went on over to our bird show. And right behind me here is her very first bird show that she did here at the LA Zoo. She's a really big centerpiece of that show now. Right now, because of COVID, our bird show is still closed. So we are really hoping that that will open soon. You guys can all come and see Hope in our bird show in her flight pattern that she does. So that is sort of an overview of our program here. I'm now going to turn it over to Chandra, one of our ace keepers. I will stop my sharing here. And Chandra will tell you more about the details of our program here.
Okay, let me get my screen sharing up. Sorry, I'm not as smooth as some people about this. All right. And begin. Is that better? Okay. So hi, and thank you for joining us while we share the story of the California Condor with you all. Again, my name is Chandra David, and I have been working with the California Condor Recovery Program for about 27 or 28 years now. So this picture, again, Beth mentioned AC9 is one of the last California condors trapped in the wild. This is a picture of that bird. And I have a little story to share about him. So I remember coming into work one day in 2002. I had only been working with condors for about 8 years at that time. And I arrived at 6 a.m. and waited in my car just outside the large gates that closed our east facility, filled with condors off from the rest of the zoo. This allowed our condors a little more privacy from the rest of the normal ongoings that occur in zoo life. Once it was light enough, I did hike up to the top of the hill and quietly open the gate leading to the observation rooms that would allow me to check the birds mostly undetected. I pulled back the black fabric, exposing a small window that looks into the roost of a pen we call Pen 23. And there sat AC9 with his beak facing that little window. I couldn't fool him. He knew I was there, and he probably knew I was there from the time I got out of my car. I took a moment, and I took a really long moment that day, and I just wanted to take it all in because this would be the last time I ever saw this bird here at the zoo. I was face to face with one of the world's most endangered birds. AC9 is a legacy. He was the last California condor to be trapped from the wild when the program knew these birds were in trouble. It was certain that if they would disappear, it was certain if we didn't step in to protect them, they would disappear forever. So when we checked the birds from the blinds, we were always quiet. But this morning I did speak to AC9. And I just said, you have no idea what's in store for you today. So later that day, AC9 was taken from Pen 23. He had a transmitter placed on him by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service so they could track his whereabouts. And he was driven to the territory he once occupied and was released back into the wild. Biologists hoped that he would show the new condors the old condor ways, while the keepers and field biologists looked for ways to steadily increase the population. AC9 was one of only 22 birds left in the world at the time when we were at our lowest numbers. This is when the Condor Recovery Program started, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife had to act fast before we lost the species. Los Angeles Zoo offered its expertise to recover the species by providing a place for breeding, egg incubation, behavioral conditioning, as well as various medical concerns. Pairing birds is very crucial to the species survival. We have to take into consideration the genetic diversity and pair compatibility. We house pairs in different locations for genetic safeguarding. You really don't want all your eggs in one basket, quite literally, in case of disease or other disasters such as fire. So it's best to have several facilities or institutions helping. Even at the zoo, we have our condors in 2 locations. So we monitor our birds very carefully at the zoo. And this is a picture of our camera system we use. They just can't find a corner to get away from us, and we like it that way. So the camera systems are useful to watch the birds at the breeding center as well as in the wild. We can gather more information without disrupting the pairs. Some field sites have cameras in the nest as well as feeding sites or release pens to monitor the birds. Satellite telemetry and GPS units have been used in many of the birds, and this allows the observer to locate the animal by latitude and longitude, and that is transmitted to them via satellite. The biologists use programs that allow the observer to see the locations from their computer versus being out in the field actively locating the animals. The information from these devices allows us to see patterns that may indicate the bird is nesting or may be sick, and in some cases, unfortunately, they notify the observer in the event of a death. So caring for condor eggs is another way the zoo kind of jumps in and helps this program out. Natural incubation is the best for eggs, but it does come with some risks. Eggs can be broken or go missing. Infertility can go unnoticed, as well as a chick not being able to hatch on its own due to being in the wrong position in the egg. We artificially incubate our eggs in a room where we can keep them safe and keep a close eye on their progress. They are weighed daily so keepers know whether or not to expect a healthy hatch. If the weight loss is too low, we know we may have to intervene to help that chick hatch. So some of the egg production problems that we do have is we can have infertility, which just means the egg was not viable. The dad didn't quite do the job, or the mom wasn't receptive or something. Another one we see is a blood ring. So that's the slide to the left. That just indicates that the egg died at a very early phase in development. So when we see something like that, we know that if we left that under the pair, we would have never had an egg out of that pair. So we can now say, hey, let's pull the dummy egg and let them recycle and make another egg for us. So it's really good to have our eggs monitored daily. Another thing we see are rarely, but breaks in eggs. And even this egg in the middle picture was able to be helped with a little glue and paper towels, and that egg hatched just fine and actually hatched in the wild in a nest. So the other thing we do are egg radiographs, and that is the slide to the left. Because artificial incubation has its limitations as well. It isn't perfect and it can lead to some problems. So a lot of these problems, they can be worked through because we are watching them every day. Radiographs are done to allow us to see what's going on inside of the egg. And this allows us to best assist each chick. Hatching assistance. Some eggs may have what we call a window. Is something we do when we think the chick might need a little extra help. So after we do the radiographs and we know where the beak is, we can put a small hole like you can see off to the left of your screen, just as to kind of give the chick a chance to get some air that he would need naturally. And then we can kind of watch him from there. And when we get closer to hatch, we start to be able to open up the egg a little bit more, like you can see in the center, see how the chick's doing. And if everything looks good inside the egg, we can continue the hatch and you get a nice little chick like you can see off to the right hand side of your screen. We do put the window in the air cell of the egg, which is if we think the chick's in a risky position because they cannot pip. And pip is something the eggs do. When you see that beak hitting the shell and it finally breaks the shell, that's what we call a pip. And the eggs also have an internal pip that goes through the membrane. And the second pip is external to the outside world through the eggshell. This often will solve a problem so the chick can hatch with or without assistance, and we won't know till we get closer to the day they hatch. Eggs take about 57 days to hatch, so we have 2 months to watch these eggs grow. Let's see, a real life example is we have egg LA1720 is a really good example of a chick that, or an egg that we had a lot of issues with. This one, the whole time we incubated, it had a potential for a membrane to tear. So, you know, when you open up your chicken eggs inside, you see a little air pocket. That's what we call an air cell. So this egg, as it grew and developed, the air cell could stick to the side of the egg. And as it expanded, it would tear and allow air into the egg with the chick, which can be fatal. It usually doesn't end well, but we're getting better at dealing with those. This egg never did develop that, but we were very cautious about doing whatever we could to prevent it. So the other thing we had with this egg, that it was not in the correct hatching position. It was upside down in the egg, as well as having its head under the left wing rather than under the usual right wing. A left wing malposition is usually lethal in birds and can result in the loss of an egg, therefore a loss of a condor chick. So we had 2 malpositions to work through with this egg, but on June 14th of 2020, the bird that some of you may have heard of, Callie or Cal, he hatched with assistance from condor keepers and continues to do well. This is a chick that we featured in some of our social media because he just was such a story, and he is doing really well right now. And then this is a picture of Callie then and now. So 20 days old, just a little guy, and then at about 6 months old with all his feathers and ready to take on the world. And just to show you the phases of a growing chick, I just included a few slides of a 6-day-old 20. They start growing really rapidly. Even by 20 days, you can see how much bigger that chick is. And then 37 days, a little over, a month, 5 weeks. 75 days, they're already huge. And 121 days is 4 months old right there, into 5 or 6 month old, which is a fledgling. So what we see at the fledgling phase is that starts with a process called branching, where they're jumping up and down, practicing getting up on lower branches, perches, stumps. And the time they spend flapping their wings and jumping up and down is something we call hop flapping. It's just adorable to watch. And those will lead to small practice flights. And they leave the nest generally in September or October, and they're fed by their parents through their first winter. So the result of breeding is we get a nice healthy condor that will be a bird that we can use to breed in zoos to safeguard genetics. And it also produces individuals for release to the wild. So we have egg swapping and just genetic management for nest success. So eggs are assessed each year for their genetics based on their parents. Geneticists determine where those genes would best be placed, and whether it's in a breeding facility or the wild, geneticists will let us know where this egg needs to go. So it's much easier to move an egg into the place it's needed rather than moving a full-size bird. So when we have the opportunity, we usually try to do it at that phase. So this just shows us taking an egg to the wild, and often to get up to the nest, it has to go inside of a little container, and you can see that hanging off the belt of the climber, a brooder strapped to his belt. There is a condor egg in there. And when you're the person who raised that egg, it's very nerve-wracking watching this climb up the mountain into a new nest. So the LA Zoo has moved as many as 16 eggs in and out of the zoo in one season in order to accommodate the needs of wild nests and the needs of other breeding facilities. This doesn't include the eggs that were laid here that stayed. In the past, if a wild nest failed, a zoo egg would be delivered to that wild nest, creating a successful hatch for wild pair that may otherwise have failed to produce anything. We have done the same for nesting pairs and breeding centers as well. Successful nesting resulting in a chick to raise strengthens the pair's bond with one another, and that often leads to successful nesting in the future without as much intervention being needed to get that pair to hatch chicks and raise them. So Beth did mention we did some cross training, and one thing we decided as we were getting more chicks in the wild that we needed to teach U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff as well as other institutions how to handle chicks, because we have been doing this for so many years. So once we had wild nests occurring in our reintroduced condors, we ran into a few problems like chicks dying from consuming microtrash. There were a few cases of West Nile virus in these chicks, as well as lead poisoning. So we began to train U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff and other agencies how to handle these condors, since we have developed really good techniques after doing it for so many years here at the zoo. We knew what a chick should look like, how they should feel, and the behavior to expect when we do go into a nest. So once we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists getting comfortable with handling chicks, we needed to learn some skills from them. So that's where the cross training and climbing comes in. They showed us how we went over to a smaller, easier spot and learned how to climb on ropes. So we all were doing the same technique so we could climb into these nests a lot more safely together. So our staff learned how to climb into nests. So we did that so we could apply that new skill safely to enter nests with Fish and Wildlife staff to assist in doing health checks on condor chicks. So the picture on the right is on my left is the first time I ever dropped into a nest. Terrifying, but it was AC9's nest, to speak of that bird again. So while doing health checks in a wild nest, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and LA zookeepers work together in that nest to help each other safely carry out that task. This picture to the left is me. I have an egg in my hand that I just removed from underneath the bird behind me. And she had been at our zoo in the past, so I think she may have remembered me a little bit, but she let me take the egg and she sat there waiting while I checked it, and then we put it back. It was kind of an interesting moment. Many of the biologists and Fish and Wildlife staff are able to handle chicks now without our help, but every once in a while they still have us come out to help when the need arises. So the result of all these health checks and taking care of the chicks in the wild, you get healthy fledglings that end up in the wild and meeting each other for the first time at a carcass like these two. Both of these chicks were chicks that I had helped within a nest and watched them grow. And it was kind of nice to have the staff send me a photo of these two guys out there greeting each other. They had never met before. And this was just so amazing to see. So there's a toggle between the zoo and the wild. So breeding condors for release is not where our job ends. Once a condor is in the wild, whether it's hatched there or released there, we still have a responsibility to assist when a bird is ill, injured, or has behavioral problems. We have had to evacuate chicks from a nest by helicopter, by climbing, hiking, and or by vehicle. Chicks and adults can be evacuated from the wild due to lead poisoning. And this is the biggest problem in the California Condor Recovery effort that we all face. Several laws have been implemented in the effort to help remove lead from the condor range. This is the key part of the recovery if we want to see these birds thrive in the wild. So this is AC9 once again. It's a picture of him at his wild nest while myself and another LA zookeeper, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service, were doing a health check on his chick. The reason I brought up AC9 at the beginning of this talk and now at the end is that he represents all of this hard work. When we were removing birds from the wild in the beginning, through our breeding program, the release program, he's been there through us doing nest interventions and monitoring. And he was the very last bird remaining in the wild at one time when there were so few birds left in the world. He produced many condors, and once he was genetically well represented, he was returned to the wild where he soon found a mate. We entered his nest each year to monitor the health of his chicks, and I cannot forget rappelling into his nest while seeing him in the wild, defending his territory and raising his chicks. He also needed to be returned to the zoo for lead treatment more than once. Each time he recovered and he was returned to the wild once again. Eventually, he went missing. Without the protection of the zoo, the species would have continued to go extinct in the wild. For 15 years in our zoo's breeding program, AC9 contributed to bringing the population of just 22 condors in the entire world up to where it is now at over 525 individuals. I'm thankful AC9 had the chance to represent a species and keep it from declining further. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with he and so many other condors that have contributed as much as they could in the time they were here on this earth to save themselves from extinction. These birds are tough and determined, and our team is very passionate about condor conservation, and we won't let them down as we do our part to help. So to learn more about what we do to help condors in the wild as well as in our zoo, I would like to introduce you to our Chief Veterinarian, Dr. Dominique Keller.
All right. Thank you, Chandra. All right, I will now try to share my screen. All righty. Go, a few more clicks. And all right, you guys should be seeing the full first slides. All right, great. Okay. So, and there we go. First tech glitch. All right, it's such a pleasure actually to be here today and to be able to give you a little insight on the veterinary care we provide for California condors at the Los Angeles Zoo. The care we give is, well, it would be great if my slides were there. So to give you a little idea of how we work, we have a fully staffed hospital here at the zoo that provides both for routine and emergency care to all residents of the zoo, and that includes wild and the hospitalized, as well as our resident California condors. We're staffed with 4 full-time vets, supported by 6 veterinary technicians, as well as our hospital keepers. The health center at the zoo is a standalone facility. We have treatment, surgical, and diagnostic areas that allow us to provide both comprehensive and timely care for all our patients, feathered or otherwise. So this photo here is one taken during a recent condor craze, actually sort of late 2020. And I put it here because you can see that it really takes a village to care for these patients. This photo has 2 veterinarians here, a veterinary technician, and 3 condor keepers working on 1 bird. So we work very closely with Chandra and the rest of the condor staff whenever we have condor patients, because their input and the reports they give us on the animals are really invaluable for providing us with the information that helps us with each and every case. So before we jump into condor medical care, I wanted to just touch a little bit on some salient points about how these birds are and some of their biology and why this is relevant to us as treating veterinarians. So as a veterinary care provider, it's very important to know your patients. In the zoo field, there can be significant biological or physiological differences that pertain to each different species that can impact something as simple as what medications you can or can't use and how you can handle each patient. Condors are New World vultures, and while they are classified in the order Accipitriformes with hawks, eagles, ospreys, and other vultures, you can't really just consider them raptors, right? So for example, their gastric or stomach pH acid level is so low that it allows them to eat carrion, that's dead things, safely. The low pH is also an excellent solubilizer, meaning it dissolves any metal they ingest, and that has huge implications for lead toxicity that we'll talk about more shortly. In addition, in their guts, they carry a lot of anaerobic bacteria that would be considered pathogenic in other species. In other words, they might be lethal in other species if you weren't a condor, but are normal for condors. We think this is important medically because some of the antibiotics that we routinely use can actually knock out some of these types of bacteria, which could cause digestive problems if we overuse them in condors. And finally, one other important anatomical feature of condors is they have this extremely large crop. So the crop is an outpouch in the esophagus, the first part of your digestive tract. So, and this is kind of what you see here, the crop here bulging out. Unlike raptors, condors don't really carry food in their talons or their feet. They fill their crops, so they carry their food in their crops sort of as a food storage or like a grocery bag. Unfortunately, the crop is particularly susceptible to dysfunction when these birds are intoxicated with lead, which means that we always have to be careful to evaluate this part of their anatomy whenever we suspect a lead intoxication case. So let's get down to the main reasons for which condors present to the zoo's health center. Chandra and Beth both touched a little bit about this on their presentations. You know that we actually get to see condors at the health center at many different life stages. The radiograph images that are on this slide are here of a condor taken in 2019. And on the right, I've highlighted the outline of the chick's skull, so you can see what staff are actually evaluating when reviewing radiographs. You can see that it takes a lot of experience to go from having no skull highlighted to having one highlighted to know what's right and what's wrong with each egg. And as Chandra pointed out, subtle changes in positioning in the egg can make a big difference to whether the egg will actually be able to hatch. The other things that we see wild condors for at the zoo are things like trauma, the ingestion of microtrash, especially by chicks, and the main thing that plagues the species right now, which is lead toxicosis. So unfortunately, trauma is in the wild because it's hard being a wild bird. And we've seen birds with bone fractures that have actually required surgical repair. So this little young bird on the left side of the slide here has a wing wrap, the blue, that supports a wing injury. But 2020, so last year, was actually unusual in that we saw trauma related to wildfires really for the first time in any significant numbers. On the right are photos from an adult male bird that presented to us a few months after he was injured in a fire. He made it through the fires, but actually sustained severe burns to both his face, neck, the keel, which is the chest bone, and his legs. You can see from the pictures here a couple different pictures that show the progression of his burns. So the first one there without the pink tissue is one of the first pictures you saw. You see, and he has a pretty severe deep burn. It actually injured the bone underlying the skin. That's how progressed that burn was. And then the second picture where you see a little bit more pink tissue, that's healing tissue where the wound is actually closed up a little bit. But that required weeks and weeks of very intense wound therapy. We're making headway with this kind of trauma, but it's definitely something that's new for us in the field of condor medicine. And both presentations prior to mine, I talked about microtrash a little bit as well. So microtrash is really just these small pieces of garbage. And historically, this has been a significant problem for nestlings. Parents, birds, these condors will ingest all kinds of materials when they're scavenging food to feed their babies. It could be metal, plastic, glass, and they'll bring this to their babies when they want to feed them because it's in with the rest of the food in their crop. So an adult bird might be able to normally cast or regurgitate this non-digestible material out of the crop without really any issues. But a small nestling is at a much higher risk of gastrointestinal impaction or death from just the sheer amount of trash that they may be fed. So Chandra actually provided me with this radiograph of the nestling, and here on the left, you can see the red arrows pointing to all the radio-opaque or non-radiographically visible material. So you can see how it shows up really strongly. It looks whiter on the x-ray. And then this on the other side of the picture here is all the amount that was taken out surgically from this animal's crop and stomach. So this particular issue is actually much less common now, primarily because there's been a more concerted nest cleaning effort in the Condor ranges. So now that brings us to what the #1 cause of death in adult condors is at this time, which is lead toxicosis. And I really want to stop here for a second because I want to make sure that everyone understands one important concept. California condors are not more susceptible to lead toxicosis than other species, but due to a number of other factors related to their biology as carrion eaters in a country where lead bullets remain an option for hunters, they're really unfortunately disproportionately affected by this environmental contaminant. And lead's a really interesting element to talk about medically. You know, neither ours or animal bodies have any use for lead, the element of lead. It's really not part of any biological mechanism or enzymatic process, so it's not really useful. But once it's inside a body, animal or otherwise, it wreaks havoc on all body systems. Once lead's ingested, it's a very soft metal, right? So it gets dissolved easily by that low stomach pH. And then it makes its way through the GI lining into the bloodstream. Then from there, it's translocated across cell membranes throughout the body because it looks to the body just like some of the other ions we need, like calcium. But lead in the bloodstream, we can still detect it for weeks. But once it's settled into something like soft tissue, like an organ or muscle, it'll stay there for months. And once it makes it into the bone, it'll actually stay there for years. Again, because it looks to the body a lot like calcium, so the body just deposits it there. So these soft and bony tissues are really just a huge reservoir of lead that can leach back into the bloodstream under the right conditions. And if an animal or person is exposed to a large amount of lead, they may actually show signs of acute toxicity, which usually present as neurologic signs. But chronic exposure, which is what we typically see in the condors, is much more insidious. If a condor is chronically exposed to lead, many of its organ systems are going to be affected, right? It's inevitable. Some of these are remarkably similar to what's seen in humans with lead toxicosis. And as I mentioned before, the neurologic system is really affected by lead because the lead element actually affects nerve function and conduction. So you might see a change in mental status where the animal might seem a little bit dull or not as responsive as you would expect. But in cases that are more severe, which we don't usually see in condors, but you can see in other animals that have lead toxicosis, you might have seizures or you might see blindness if the levels of lead are really high. This impairment of the central nervous system means that a condor can't do its normal functions as well as it should. So for example, it can't feed or care for itself, much less its young, or react to danger appropriately if it's intoxicated. And lead's effects on the GI system are also really super devastating for condors. I mentioned early on that the crop in condors is really affected by lead. And what happens is what's called gastrointestinal stasis or GI stasis, which is where the gut and the crop, as part of the gut, motility or movement slows down or even stops. And food and water are just going to sit there and accumulate and distend that crop further and further. The food starts to ferment or rot, and it eventually erodes that crop lining. And then at that point, the condor is unable to move the food into its stomachs, and it will starve to death, even though it has food in the crop if it's not treated. And as this GI stasis progresses, the condor is obviously going to become weaker and weaker, not just because it can't process any nutrients, because it can't swallow them, can't ingest them, can't absorb them, but also because the lead is impairing basic cellular metabolism by disrupting normal enzymatic processes in cells. The condor may become anemic, as red blood cell production is impaired, and impaired vitamin D synthesis also affects calcium metabolism, so the bones become weaker and more easily damaged or broken. The severity of lead toxicosis is really going to depend on a number of factors, how old the bird is, how much body mass it has, what nutritional state it's in when it gets the lead toxicity, as well as how much lead it ingests and over what time frame. Some chronically affected birds that we've seen really somehow manage to adapt a little bit. I mean, condors are tanks. They may not show as many of the signs that I've just described, but others might be much more affected by the same levels of lead. So how do we diagnose lead toxicosis? Well, the field biologists who've been trained by our condor keepers and have learned over the years, they've become very adept at recognizing clinical signs, even the subtle ones. And so there's usually an index of suspicion, plus they're condors and we know what their main issue is, lead. However, we confirm lead poisoning by finding either metal fragments on radiographs and checking the lead levels. In this image, with all the highlights here, you can see this is an image from the National Park Service. The birds actually ingested a large bullet that's in the middle of the circle there. But what I wanted to point out is that's not actually the biggest issue. In the inset, where those little yellow circles are, those are tiny, tiny, barely visible lead fragments, and those could be lethal, as small as they are. So once a bird's been confirmed to have lead toxicosis, we need to start a treatment regimen. This has been developed over many years of treating these condors. The mainstay of treatment is actually supportive care, so that we give them fluid therapy, we provide nutritional support. Remember, most of these birds are very weak and they're starving because of the issues that lead causes. So we have to be very careful and slow in refeeding them, because restarting food too fast can be really hard on the metabolic system, and they're already compromised. So we really just have to be very careful. To actually remove the lead from the tissues, we use what's called a chelator or a binder. It's called calcium EDTA, and it physically binds the lead and allows it to be excreted to the kidneys and through the GI tract once it's moving. We give birds injections of this medication once a day for 5 days, and then we give them a little break, and then we'll repeat these rounds of chelation as often as is necessary to get blood levels down to what we consider acceptable levels. Sometimes that chelation alone isn't enough, and if you see some of those fragments that I pointed out in that radiograph, they might sometimes need to be removed either by flushing them out of the crop using just fluid while the animal's asleep, or actually surgically removed from the stomach. Again, both of these procedures require anesthesia because the birds aren't going to allow us to do that awake, but to give them the best chance of survival, it sometimes does need to be done. This is a very time and labor intensive treatment. It involves a lot of handling of the birds, which is stressful for them and also for us, but in the right cases, the regimen works really, really well. So that was a whirlwind tour. I gave you a very brief overview about some of the veterinary care that we provide for California condors here at the zoo, and I really want to emphasize once again that it does take a village, and in this case it's the LA Zoo Village, to care for these incredible animals. I feel so privileged to work with this group and with these animals. It really is, like Beth said, it's the highlight of a career. And every case is unique, and so we learn something new from every condor, and hopefully something that we can apply to the next case. The birds are survivors, they're hardy, but they're also fragile in their own unique ways, and it's really our role to help each individual survive so that the species as a whole can live and thrive. And that's what I've got for you guys. And I think we have some time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Keller and Chandra and Beth. What an informative talk. And I love birds, so I appreciate all of the information you all shared. We're now going to open up the chat for some questions from our viewers. If you have a question for our presenters, please use either the chat function or the Q&A function to submit your questions. And we'll be happy to, I'm happy to answer. Tell our presenters, and they'll be happy to answer. My first question for our presenters is, what can our viewers do to help the California condors? You know, most of us are, you know, not in the wildlife field, and so what can they do to help?
Oh, I think best to let Beth and Chandra answer that one. I'll just definitely throw in, don't use lead ammunition if you can, and encourage everybody not to use lead ammunition.
I think that's what it really comes down to, is they're really not going to thrive in the wild until we get people behind using non-lead ammunition. And even if everybody started doing that tomorrow, we still have several years in front of us of treating birds for lead, because they're going to find it somewhere, and there's people that have loads of it hidden. And even if somebody means well, they can still make a mistake and expose the condors to lead. We've had situations where a rancher had no idea he had to dispatch a sick animal, and they shoot it, and they are doing the animal a favor in their opinion, but they have no idea that 12 condors are going to come down and feed on it. So it's just getting people behind the idea that lead is poisonous to all life, and we should really remove it from everything, like we have done in gasoline so far, in paint. It's the next phase.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. We have one question from one of our viewers wondering what states the condors fly in the wild.
What states?
Yeah, what's their territory range?
Oh, well, we have them in Southern California and Central California. You'll see them on the Big Sur coast and the Central coast inland from Pinnacles National Park. We have them right in Ventura County. You'll see them flying in Arizona. They have a release site in the Vermilion Cliffs, and you'll see some in Utah and Baja California.
Fantastic. How are the condors being affected by all of the wildfires in California?
Oh gosh, this year I haven't heard too much, but I know that last year when we had the Dolan fire, it was pretty devastating for the population. The Central California birds, I believe 11 birds were seriously impacted and resulted in deaths. And we had to evacuate chicks from nests that were vulnerable. So if it's in their range, it can be pretty devastating to them. We've had some chicks where a fire just went up a side of a cliff right alongside their nest and they were okay, but we can't always guarantee that's going to happen. So this year, I'm not sure, but we have had some pretty high losses from last year's.
Yeah, it's affecting quite a few wildlife, but I'm glad to hear that. This year, things, so hopefully at this moment, seem to be okay for the condors. We do have another question just asking, what do you feed the condors while they're at the zoo?
They eat dead things, of course. So that's their specialty. But in the zoo, we typically feed rats, rabbits, ground feline diet product that's like a ground meat. And then they get some pork right now, some sides of pork, which they love. In the wild, they'll eat different things from, small rodents to deer, pig, and up to whale.
Wow, even whale.
Yeah, even whale.
Wow. And then what other institutes work with the condors besides the LA Zoo?
Oh God, there's so many agencies involved. I mean, Beth, maybe help me fill in if I forget something, but we work alongside Santa Barbara Zoo, San Diego Zoo, the Peregrine Fund has a breeding center, Oregon Zoo, the Chapultepec Zoo in Mexico City. We have birds in wild institutions like Ventana Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Park Service works with us. Beth, if I forget anything, you can.
The Oakland Zoo, although they don't breed, they have started taking on some of the lead birds. So it's a little bit closer for some of the birds that are up north. So they're also a partner. But yeah, there's a lot of partners.
Davis
Fantastic.
joined in as well just recently. They
Who?
might see a few. UC Davis,
Mm.
but I don't know that they've actually seen any birds yet. But they're part of the program now.
That's great. We had a couple people ask for updates on Aniko and Ava. Would you be able to provide any updates on those two birds?
I guess I can say that they're in the pre-release pen with some other birds their age and maybe a little older, as well as a mentor. And they are doing fantastic. They're very much huge characters, huge personalities in our flock. They're doing great. They fit in perfectly and seem quite content to hang out with other birds their age.
That is great. And I have another question, kind of also talks about turkey vultures, but just kind of wondering what about turkey vultures anatomy makes them more successful in the wild than condors? That might be more of the vet question. I don't know.
I think it's a group question. I mean,
Yeah.
there's probably a lot of reasons. One, they're probably eating slightly different things. And so they might be just in a different niche. And there's a lot of them to begin with. I think they reproduce better than condors. And I mean, that question, why exactly, might be difficult to answer right now. Chandra,
Yeah.
Beth, any other thoughts?
Yeah, one of my thoughts too is, of course, they haven't had the drop in numbers, at least that we know of, but we aren't monitoring them as intensely. So we don't know that we're losing a certain percentage to lead. And again, if they have more offspring per season, we may not see that impact as strongly. But there's a lot of wildlife succumbing to things like lead poisoning and micro trash that we have no idea that that's happening behind the scenes, because we're not following those animals around like we do the condors. I mean, they're heavily monitored. So unfortunately, I think we're missing things like golden eagles, bald eagles, coyotes, ravens, turkey vultures. I think they are succumbing to some of the same problems condors have had, but because they produce a little more quickly, maybe they're not as susceptible to losing the population like condors have.
Fantastic. It was a very large question, but thank you for that. Okay, somebody asked about personality differences between, if there are any, between captive condors versus wild condors. Anything that you've seen since working with them?
You know, I would say that between wild and the birds that we have at the zoo, I have not seen a difference in personality. They're the same character in here and out there. They all have different personalities. They're incredible to watch. There is no difference unless we have a bird that maybe something went wrong in its past that we don't know. And so there might be a behavioral issue. And then usually if we see that in the wild, they have to come back into the zoo if it's going to impact their success in the wild. And usually with age that resolves itself. But I haven't seen a difference. They just are very playful, very serious, very protective, loving parents here and there.
Fantastic. We also had somebody have a question about, I believe, Condor 374. Is that, I think I'm reading it correctly, but they were just wondering, I guess, about his recent passing. And we just had some more questions about the lead toxicity and how that could potentially have affected him.
Unfortunately, I would have to look up his records offhand. I'm not sure unless somebody like Dominique might remember, but I'm sorry, I don't.
That's okay. There's so many of them now, so I'm sure it's hard to remember all of their numbers. That's all right.
374, yeah, which one was he?
That's okay. It's all right. Somebody was also asking about what various personalities or behaviors the condors show, in captivity and also in the wild, especially if they know their handler. Because you had mentioned, Chandra, that you thought maybe potentially one of those birds you potentially would have remembered you. So just any specific traits that they show about remembering, or just in general what their personalities are like.
I think that they definitely can recognize other individuals or people, but it's just like any animal that might know a certain person in a certain place. So I know that I can do some things around the facility and they don't, if they're stressed or happy or not, maybe it's not too bad. But if I have a new person come in from maybe grounds maintenance to help, they definitely react a little bit more to the unsureness of that. So they definitely have a comfort with people they've seen before or have had experience with before. But if that goes to the wild, usually it changes because they have other things they have to deal with, like protecting a chick. So, I've been in a nest where a bird might be more calm because I'm there, or maybe it's just my behavior because I'm comfortable there, they're feeding off of. It's hard to know exactly where that's coming from, but their personality, they're very reserved in the wild. If you're at their nest, they're going to be calm and relaxed off to the side of the nest, but they're just trying to get through this and look, kind of save face and not look too flustered, because that doesn't bode well for them and their mate. But yeah, I think once they're in the wild, they just know they can leave at any time. They're going to not tolerate as much as they would when they're here at the zoo.
That's great. Thank you. We also had somebody wonder if condors can problem solve like corvids can.
I mean, of course, I would say I believe that they can, but I'm trying to think of a good example that I have seen. I mean, I guess in a way we have to help us monitor our birds' health. We don't like to go inside their flight pens and chase them around. We don't want to do that to them. It's risky for everybody because they're really large flight spaces. So we have taught them that they come into a smaller area for food, and we have kind of played games where you're not going to get that food until you approach the door in a certain way. So it takes them a little bit, but they start putting that together. So I think they can problem solve because they're trying to figure out how to get that door open faster to get to their meal. And I see some of them really put on an extra effort to make that happen quickly. And then they also are aware that we're up to something. I think they can hear our footsteps are different. If they know we're going to trap them that day, they hear like our footsteps, or we did something wrong at the gate because we're nervous. So they won't even come over at that point. So that's another problem solving, is those people are acting odd. Let's not do anything correctly today. So I would say yes.
Thank you for that. And thank you all so much for taking the time to come and speak with us and tell us about these amazing birds. And thank you to everyone for their questions as well. I'm very excited to hopefully be able to see Dolly and Hope. Is it Hope's the one that is does the bird show? So hopefully the bird shows can start soon. I'm looking forward to seeing her in flight. But before we wrap things up, I'd like to extend an invitation to another one of our upcoming events. This Saturday, we're hosting a special adoption event for small companion animals, Critter Carnival, which will welcome local shelters and rescues to help find homes for pets, including rabbits, lizards, turtles, hamsters, and more. We'll also have food and games provided. And feel free to, I think we threw in the link to the event in the chat to RSVP for this free event. And thank you so much to Chandra, Dr. Keller, and Beth and the entire LA Zoo team for your support and for taking the time this evening to share a special look at the amazing work that you do. And I'm so excited to see what will go on in the future with these condors. And finally, thank you to all of our viewers for joining us this evening and supporting conservation efforts. And have a great night.